Buenos días a todos desde el Xoán de Lugo, otra vez con nuestra sesión de entrevistas de Italian Job. Y hoy tenemos de verdad un enorme placer en tener al profesor John Lennox para hacer entrevista y hablar sobre Dios, la ciencia, su último libro sobre inteligencia artificial. El profesor Lennox es profesor de matemáticas emérito en la Universidad de Oxford y también de filosofía de la ciencia emeritus en Green Templeton College. Y tenemos de verdad el honor y el placer. El profesor Lennox también escribió muchísimos libros hablando sobre Dios, por ejemplo, God's Undertaker, Gunning for God, y sus últimos libros son Where is God in a Coronavirus World y sobre inteligencia artificial, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity, que tiene un título muy interesante también, que es 2084. Entonces, Professor Lennox, thank you very much, first of all, for being with us and for this.
Es un placer para mí. Buenos días a todos.
So to start, I mean, you've written on so many things, you've lectured on so many things, but I know you have an interesting story of how you came, you know, as to be interested in mathematics, but mainly, you know, in your interest in Christian apologetics. I know you cite mostly in your conferences and in your works C.S. Lewis. So how did you come through to all of this, and how, you know, what importance did people like C.S. Lewis have in your journey?
Well, of course, my story starts with my parents. And I was born and went to school in a very small country, Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland, sadly, has a history of sectarian violence. My parents were quite unusual because we lived in a very difficult part, divided communities between Protestants and Catholics, although it was much more complex than that. And my father had a departmental store, and I suppose he employed maybe 30 people. But he deliberately employed people from both communities. And that was very difficult. It meant that he was bombed on several occasions. And my brother nearly lost his life. And I asked my father once, why do you do that? Why risk that? He said, well, I believe the teaching of the Bible that says all men and women, no matter what they believe, are made in the image of God, and they're therefore of infinite value, and I am going to treat them like that. Now, that was a hugely important lesson for me, to respect people who have a different worldview, and I've done that all my life. The second gift my parents gave to me, and it was a very big gift in a sectarian community, and that was, although they were very deep believing Christians, they gave me space and allowed me to make up my own mind. They didn't force me to think like they did, but rather they encouraged me to think and ask questions, not only about Christianity, but about other worldviews. So I grew up in a very unusual environment where Christianity was open to questioning. You could ask questions about anything, and you were encouraged to think about big issues. Now, first of all, at school, I was very passionate about arithmetic because I could do it easily. But then I discovered languages, and I liked Latin, and I wanted to become a Latin student. And then modern languages joined that, because I learned to speak French quite young, and German as well later. But I did mathematics because I was quite good at it. But my headmaster said, look, would you like to go to Cambridge? And I said, well, I mean, that sounds an impossible dream. Well, he said, I can teach you mathematics, but there's no other subject in the school that you can do. Small school, you know, and not many good teachers. So I did mathematics and I went to Cambridge. And at Cambridge, I was always interested in the big questions. What I mean by that is this: how much can we learn from mathematics? It's part of science. How much can we learn from science? Does it explain everything? Or is there more? And what is the relationship between science and the deeper questions of life, the worldview questions? What is the meaning of life? Where do I come from? Where am I going? And all those things. And when I arrived in Cambridge, I saw it as a huge opportunity to meet people who did not share my background or my worldview, and to get to know them, to make friends, to find out what was behind what they believed. And I've spent my entire life doing that. And so I've always been interested, though in recent years, in the last 15 years or so, I have been more on the world stage debating major figures like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Peter Singer and a lot of other people like that, taking a public platform. And I've done it in Spain as well. I've given several very big public lectures in Madrid, because I believe it's important that people hear from different perspectives. And I want to encourage public debate. So that's a very rough background to it all.
And how did C.S. Lewis have an impact on you, which you...
C.S. Lewis, my father read C.S. Lewis, and he immediately saw that this was special. So he gave me my first C.S. Lewis book when I was about 10 or 11, I suppose. And I immediately saw that this was something very different. And when I went to Cambridge in 1962, Lewis was still there. And I discovered he was lecturing. I did not realize that these would be his very last lectures, but I went to some of them and heard him in person give lectures on the poet, the English poet, John Donne. And it was quite an experience to listen to Lewis. But he had a profound effect on me. Why? Because of the clear logic of his thinking. Now, Lewis was no mathematician, but he understood geometry and he knew how to use scientific concepts to illustrate difficult philosophical and theological ideas. And so his influence on me has been lifelong. It has been profound. And I constantly go back to reading his books to see how one should write books.
That's very, very interesting. You've mentioned your debates with Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Peter Singer, Atkins, and the New Atheists. C.S. Lewis used to criticize atheism extremely in all of his books. What do you think are the main problems with New Atheism, if one can sort of summarize? Is it because they believe science can actually explain everything? Is it because they do not have a grasp of theology, of studying the Bible as a historical document as well, or at least as embedded in history? What do you think are the main, since you've debated with all of these New Atheists, what do you personally think is the main problem with this new document?
Well, you have actually put your finger on several of the major problems. There's not just one problem, there's a whole list of problems. There are problems with their understanding of science itself, and certainly problems of their lack of understanding of theology and their failure to take seriously disciplines other than science. For example, you mentioned the reliability and authenticity of the New Testament. They don't read the ancient historians because they come out with statements that no one would make if they had read ancient historians. And I don't mean Christian ancient historians, I just mean ancient historians. Like they make silly remarks about possibly Jesus didn't exist, or all this kind of stuff. So one of my problems is they claim to be intellectuals. Now, one of the rules in the academic world is if you go outside your own field, which I'm doing in this interview, I'm a pure mathematician, you must check with the experts in the field that you're going into. That's rule number one. And if you're an ethnologist like Dawkins, and you're going to talk about history and the New Testament, you need to check with the historians. But he didn't. If you're a Dawkins and want to talk about psychology and psychiatry and say God is a delusion, you need to find out, is that what psychiatrists think? And he clearly didn't, because it's not what they think. So that concerns me. This is anti-intellectual. But I suppose, speaking as a scientist and someone really interested in logic, I find that one of the main problems with atheism taken seriously is something that Lewis saw very clearly. And that is, if you believe that there is no God, and that therefore the human mind with which you do science is simply the end product of a mindless, unguided process, then you effectively undermine rationality. You give no reason to trust your thinking, especially when it does science. And this is one of those cases where I do believe that atheism shoots itself not in the foot. Shooting yourself in the foot is quite painful. It shoots itself in the brain, and that's fatal. So that's one of the arguments that Lewis developed. He said, look, any theory that says the human mind is unreliable cannot be true. That thinking is unreliable cannot be true, because you reach that theory by thinking. And he said that in 1940. Well, in more recent years, thinkers like Alvin Plantinga and more recently the atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel have made this point very clearly, that if evolutionary naturalism is true as an explanation of human rationality, there's something wrong, because it undermines human rationality. And then the final point, I suppose, well, there are many points. I've filled books with them. I wrote a book not long ago called Can Science Explain Everything? And I'm passionate about science. It can explain many things, but it can't explain everything. As the really great scientists saw, Einstein, for example, put it brilliantly when he said, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science. You cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics, because science doesn't tell us. Let me put it this way. Science can tell you that if you give your grandmother arsenic, it'll probably kill her. But science cannot tell you whether you should do so in order to get your hands on her property. In other words, it's got no ethical prescription built in. And I feel that often the atheist approach is far too narrow when they say that the scientific explanation is the only valid one. That's sheer nonsense, because that statement that the scientific explanation is the only valid one is not a result of science to start with. So if the statement is true, it's false. It's logically incoherent. And I find that children can understand this. I often say to them, look, why is the water boiling? Here's an explanation. It's boiling because of the heat coming from a flame, agitating the molecules of water. But no, that's not right. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. And they laugh and they say, no, sir, you need both. I said, of course. There are two kinds of explanation. One is in terms of science, And the other is in terms of human agency, my desire for a cup of tea, my volition. Now, it's obvious to a 10-year-old, in my experience, that those two explanations do not conflict with each other. They do not compete with each other. They run together. They run parallel to each other. They're complementary explanations. And I wish some professors could see that. When they say the scientific explanation is the only rational one, that's nonsense. And one of the problems in contemporary academia is the rise of what we call scientism. That is the idea that science is the only way to truth. Now, that's logically incoherent for the reason I gave earlier. But you see, it clearly isn't the only way to truth, nor is science coextensive with rationality. Perhaps that's the better way to put it. So many people think that if it's not a result of the natural sciences, it isn't rational. But that's ridiculous. Philosophy, literature, theology, the arts in general, economics, and so on. They're not the natural sciences, but they're perfectly rational intellectual disciplines. And if science was the only way to truth, your university would have to close half of its faculties tomorrow. So for all of those reasons, let me put it this way to you, provocatively. One of the major reasons I reject atheism is because I'm a scientist, not because I'm a Christian. Because anything that undermines science, I can't buy it. Now, of course, I reject atheism for many other reasons, and one of them is because I believe the Christian explanation is by far the best one. I believe it to be true, but I still reject atheism because it undermines science, it undermines thinking. So that gives you, I suppose, a rough response, but there's a great deal of this, I might say, if I may, on my website, johnlennox.org, and in my books.
Yes, I really encourage everybody who's listening to us to go to Professor Lennox's website, and there's plenty of information, and you can always buy these very interesting books.
And some of them, if I may say, some of them are in Spanish. An increasing number of my books are in Spanish.
Great. You've mentioned something interesting. You've mentioned Alvin Plantinga, and there are other philosophers who have presented rational arguments for the existence of God, aside from Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne. Why do you just said before that you think that the Christian explanation is the best explanation? What is the best argument, or the argument that you think is the most convincing for you, and also in relation to these philosophers?
Well, I think I turn the question round. The best argument depends on the person asking the question, because an argument that works for one person, the other person might not see it. For example, some people feel that the cosmological argument for the existence of God, as advanced, say, by William Lane Craig, and Richard Swinburne, and Richard's a colleague of mine, I know Richard, are very powerful. Others say, no, for them, the historical authenticity of the New Testament. And others say, no, it's my experience. So when you ask a question, what's the best argument? My response is, it depends on who's asking the question. And in my own case, because I'm constantly interacting with people, the argument for me is built up of a whole lot of sub-arguments from all these different disciplines. It's cumulative in that sense. So let me put it this way. Generic questions like the one you just asked are the hardest to answer. Specific questions, you can either answer them or you can't. So we need to be a bit more specific here, I think.
Yeah. One of the arguments, for example, that the atheists have made in history. They have relied on the universe as being infinite.
Yes.
And it goes back to Aristotle, the ancient Greeks.
Yeah,
And
that's
yet
right.
it seems that in schools, the Big Bang is not seen as an explanation that can actually fit very well with the theistic explanation. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it's very interesting this, because the idea of the Big Bang, though not the name, goes back actually to a Belgian priest called Georges Lemaitre, who was a brilliant astrophysicist and was studying Einstein's equations. And he could see that there was a solution of those equations that depended on your believing that the universe had a start, space time had a commencement. In other words, the universe is finite backwards in time. And at that time, very few people took him seriously. Now, I'm old, and I was alive in the 1960s when massive evidence began to come in terms of the discovery by Penzias and Wilson of the microwave background. Hubble had already shown the galactic redshift, that the universe was expanding. And putting those things together with Lemaitre's ideas, we reach what is now called the standard model of physics, where space-time starts in a singularity, and therefore Aristotle's ideas of an eternal universe, time-wise, are seem to be false in the eyes of most physicists. And that's fascinating, of course, because you see, the Bible has been saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, for thousands of years. But people didn't take it seriously as something that might suggest looking for evidence. Let me illustrate this for you. I was at a very prestigious conference, and I'm not really allowed to tell you where it was or who was there, but it was a group of physicists, mathematicians, philosophers, and people like me, and so on, discussing, is there a common language that we can talk about these things? And I was asked to say something about the Christian position, and I mentioned the Genesis statement, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and I was interrupted by a very well-known physicist who said, surely you're joking. Please tell us you're joking when you say that the Bible has anything relevant to tell us in the 21st century. And I said, I'm not joking at all. I said, isn't it interesting that for centuries, this statement has been in front of everybody's eyes, in the beginning God created, and yet it wasn't until the 1960s that you physicists took that idea seriously. And not only that, when it came, it was resisted in the scientific establishment, particularly in the UK, because I remember reading an editorial in the journal Nature where the editor, a man called Maddox, said something like, we mustn't go down this road of there being a beginning because it'll give too much leverage to people that believe in God. Well, that is spectacular to me, that here was arguably the best advance in cosmology in the 20th century being resisted because it appeared to support what the Bible was saying. And then I said this to this conference. I said, look, can you not see that if instead of relying on Aristotle, you had thought, well, look, there's an alternative worldview actually believed by more people, that there was a beginning. Why don't we take that as a hypothesis and see, can we find any evidence for it? I said, my suspicion is if you'd done that, you might have found the evidence earlier. No reply. And it seems to me this is very important, that here is a scientific result upon which most scientists agree that confirms what the Bible has been saying. Now, I'm aware that theological interpretation changes, so does science, but nevertheless, in the current state of play, there's a convergence between the biblical statement about the beginning and the standard model of physics.
Interesting. Do you also think there is a convergence also between the explanation for God, the existence of God, and also at least a compatibility, let's say, and our Darwinian theory of evolution? I know Richard Dawkins, and they always rely on excessively on this one, saying it just simply, with either you accept one or the other, you cannot go. How do you view this? Do you think this dichotomy is artificial, or do you think there's something to it?
Oh, well, I think a great deal about this. Mathematicians have a track record of skepticism about some of the claims made by neo-Darwinism. And as I see the situation, I'm not a biologist, but I read a great deal of biology. In fact, I've attended very important seminars in Oxford on systems biology, which I'll come to in a moment. But what seems to me to be the case, and Sir Fred Hoyle, who was a brilliant mathematician, pointed out long ago, that the kind of mechanisms, if we can call them that, natural selection, genetic drift, certainly explains something. Humans look different, and even the members of most species look different from each other. And so you get a certain amount of evolutionary development and change and fitting into niches and so on. But Hoyle pointed out that mathematically, and he'd done the calculation, this is not a creative process. You don't get major genetic changes as a result of it. Now, there's been tension about that for a long time, and Richard Dawkins has been adamant in saying that natural selection is the solution. Now, as I judge it, and remember, I'm not a biologist, that is changing very rapidly at the moment, because systems biology has shown through the work of Barbara McClintock and then currently Dennis Noble in Oxford and James Shapiro in Chicago, that the levels of complexity that we now discover and the capacity, for example, of a genome to modify itself, which is absolutely contrary to neo-Darwinian theory, has meant that there is what is now called the third way in biology. This is a scientific movement, many big names in it, who say not that neo-Darwinism needs to be improved, but it needs to be replaced. Now, that is a seismic change. Still, most of them believe there may be some naturalistic solution, purely naturalistic solution. Now, of course, the result of these developments means that my skepticism has grown enormously, because I do not see the evidence that unguided natural processes can produce, can be creative. Guided natural processes, of course, can be. And that is what many people think, that the Darwinian mechanism was guided, and therefore there are many Christians that hold to it. But it seems to me that there are a lot of issues that need to be treated there, because the majority view in biology that by a neo-Darwinian process, you mean something unguided. If you're going to say it's guided, you would want to be able to say, well, how did that happen? And there are not too many ideas forthcoming. I'm much more convinced that what biology is revealing, just like cosmology has revealed in a revolutionary move that there was a beginning, so biology in this new revolutionary move is revealing that the nature of the complexity of living things, and I'm very careful in saying that, the nature of the complexity, that is its language like. DNA, the human genome, is a word of 3.4 billion letters long. And all of our intuitions are that when you see even a few symbols, the word exit on a door, EXIT, 4 letters, you know that whatever natural processes have been involved in getting that there, there's a mind behind it. I want to apply the same in biology. And in fact, as a result of these new developments, I have completely rewritten the book that you mentioned, God's Undertaker. There's a new book appearing in July called Cosmic Chemistry: Do Science and God Mix? And a large part of it is devoted to the enormous problems now with neo-Darwinism and discussing what the replacement is and what implications it has for theology. So at the moment, as I talk to you, I see absolutely no threat from biology. And I think Dawkins' ideas are so old-fashioned and out of date and probably largely wrong. And so for me, the way is much more open than it was 20 years ago to believe the explanation, ultimate explanation, which goes like this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. All things came to exist through the Word. In other words, this is a word-based universe, not a universe based on mindless, unguided, naturalistic processes. So that's the exact opposite. The word base, which then means that the theory of information in physics is utterly fundamental, and you cannot reduce information, although it's difficult to define what that is, to physics itself. So these are all utterly fascinating things, and I'm trying to wrestle with them. But it seems to me that biology is moving on, and there are new developments that facilitate, I believe, accepting a much more deep understanding of the idea that this is a word-based universe.
Has this idea, you've published recently 2 very interesting books, one on the problem of suffering related to coronavirus, and the latest one, if I'm not wrong, on artificial intelligence. Does this change in your perspective, let's say, and your increasing skepticism also have an impact on this last book you wrote on artificial intelligence? You've just said, for example, that it's very difficult to reduce information to physics, and this idea of what is information, what is knowledge, how do we acquire knowledge, what is the difference between human intelligence and what can it how can it be replicated, so to speak? How do you view artificial intelligence, and has this view affected your
to a certain extent, of course it has, because when you look at artificial intelligence, of course, there's a lot of misunderstanding here. And why I wrote the book 2084 was to, first of all, say to people, look, you've heard a lot of hype, you've watched the film The Matrix, you've read dystopias like 1984, and you've seen that a lot of it has come true. We're now in the age of Big Brother. That has actually happened. But I wanted to point out that artificial intelligence falls into 2 kinds. The first, narrow AI, is the stuff that we use now, and some of it is very helpful, even in finding vaccines for COVID-19. Pattern recognition is wonderful for recognizing diseases, but it also can be used to spy on people and actually suppress minorities, as we've seen in certain parts of the world. So the stuff that works, large databases, algorithms that recognize something, and powerful computers, they're really doing something. Some of it's very good, particularly in medicine. Some of it is questionable, and some of it is evil. And therefore, it needs a huge amount of ethical input, which it's not really getting. But then there's general artificial intelligence. And that's a very different thing, because that has two sides. One, the quest to enhance existing human intelligence and turn us into super intelligent beings. That's the transhumanist agenda. And one of the most famous proponents of it is Yuval Noah Harari in his book Homo Deus. But then there's the other view, and that is to start from a silicon base, say, and construct an intelligent entity that is not dependent on biology, and so enjoys some kind of eternal existence. Now, both of those things, there's so much hype, and the experts tell me we're nowhere near achieving them, but nevertheless, we're achieving quite a lot, enough to make some people alarmed. Now, why am I concerned? Because some of these developments involve meddling with what it means to be a human. And that raises huge ethical questions for me. We started this interview when I mentioned my parents saying that every man and woman is made in the image of God. That is an absolute basic conviction for me. Now, the current view, and many of the AI proponents are atheists, and they take the view the human being is fluid. We've only reached a certain stage now as a result of mindless evolution, but we're clever. And therefore, we can now guide evolution ourselves and intelligently design the future of human beings. Now, we have to do a lot of hard thinking of what that means, because C.S. Lewis again saw, he wrote a book in 1940 called The Abolition of Man that I think everybody ought to read. And he saw there that if in the end the nature of human beings is accessible to science and can be modified by certain scientists, that what they make will be an artifact according to their own views. And therefore the final, and I'm quoting Lewis now, roughly, the final triumph of science will be the abolition of human beings. So I'm very concerned about that. And I wanted to write a book that was encouraging young people who are bright in science to go into AI, and also those who can think about ethics to get involved in this discussion, because it's one of the most important discussions going on in the world today.
Most of these thinkers that talk about artificial intelligence, they always, or at least most of them, say that the human mind is a machine, an advanced machine, but it is a machine. What is like? How would you respond to that? And do you think that this statement must be shows a deficit, so to speak, in their knowledge regarding the philosophy of the mind, or at least do you think that one should study more carefully the issues regarding dualism or illomorphism, or what do you think about all of this?
Well, in the nature of machines, according to the experts that work in information theory, like Brillouin, who was a genius, and Johann von Neumann, and so on, machines can process information, but they cannot create it. Now, that is a huge statement, and it needs investigation, and is still under investigation. But people like Sir Peter Medawar and so on, and Brillouin himself, believed that. One of my colleagues who's just won the Nobel Prize in Oxford, who is a genius of a mathematician, Sir Roger Penrose, he thinks that there's real evidence that the human mind is not a machine, because the human mind is capable of things that machines cannot do. And one of those is ideas like the mathematics of Gödel's theorem, which is a brilliant piece of mathematical work that Gödel did, Austrian mathematician, many years ago, where he showed that no consistent theory in arithmetic could prove its own consistency, and secondly, that arithmetic was always incomplete. There were always things that were true that you couldn't prove in an axiomatic system. And of course, a machine, if you're thinking of everything as a machine proving would be based on that kind of a system. These are very complex ideas, but it interests me that even people coming from a psychological background will reject the notion that the human mind is a machine. And of course, if you take that seriously, if my computer lets me down, I just chuck it away. That's it. And if human beings let me down, well, there have been generations of people, worst in the 20th century, that have said, well, just let's get rid of them. And so Stalin got rid of 100 million, Pol Pot millions, Mao millions, and Hitler millions. And the tragedy of that is they lost a fundamental ethical perception of the value of human beings. And that's why I would want to warn people, and there are others who don't share my Christian worldview who do the same thing. They are concerned that we will irreparably and irretrievably modify the definition of human beings, and it'll be too late. So these are huge issues, but they're very important to think about. Ideas of consequences. And unfortunately, the idea of the universe as a machine or the person as a machine, think of Newton and Descartes, have had implications in philosophy that haven't been altogether good.
And there's also all the element of consciousness, right?
Oh, there is. Consciousness is the biggest barrier in the way of reconstructing anything like the human mind, for the very simple reason that nobody knows what consciousness is. And I get this question very often. I mentioned it in my book, 2084. Until you can tell me what consciousness is, don't talk to me about reconstructing a human being. And of course, there's a huge debate, are machines conscious and all this kind of stuff.
Yes. So to conclude, I don't want to steal any more precious time. What do you think, relating to all of this we've talked about, people who want to study more about this, who want to learn more about artificial intelligence and try to connect it right with the big questions, as you say, how do you see, first of all, the future that lies ahead of us, and second of all, what would you tell to these people that would like to learn these questions? How should they approach all these issues that seem so immense and so complex to them, but at the end of the day are actually, as you've just said, the most important ones?
Well, first of all, let me say you're not stealing my time. It's a real pleasure to talk with someone like yourself, and I've enjoyed it immensely. The second thing to say is I'm not a prophet. I don't know what's coming at us in the future. I can make some guesses, but they're not worthwhile. But how do we prepare for it? Well, that's why I've written my books, actually, is to try to get across to thinking people, without being dogmatic, some of the lines of thought that I think are helpful. Now, my own procedure in learning is if I find a book that's helpful, I start looking at the footnotes. What has this person read? And I start reading those books. And that's what I would recommend to people. You can if you like, you don't have to, but you can if you like. If you're interested in AI, have a look at my book. And there's a huge number of things that I have read. And you can find your own way. And that's the best way to do it. It's much better, I say to students, even PhD students, I say to them, find your own books, and that will give you the quest of a lifetime. But one of the biggest things, and I'd like to conclude with this, thinking about artificial intelligence, when people have this hope of uploading their brains and living eternally. Harari thinks that we're going to solve the problem of physical death, and although we may die, we won't have to die, and all this kind of stuff. And we must try to enhance human happiness. Well, I say, you're too late. And people say, what? I say, you're far too late, because the problem of human death has actually been solved. It was solved 20 centuries ago when Jesus Christ rose from the dead by the power of God. And simultaneously, I said, that solves your uploading problem. You want to live forever. You want eternal life. You want something to remain of yourself. And you think you can do it by encoding yourself on silicon. Well, you're welcome to try. But I can tell you this, and I think there's much more evidence for it, that what Christ has to offer to people, it's spectacular. But I believe it to be true that if we trust him as Savior and Lord, then we receive his life. Now, we don't have to wait for it until after death. And eventually he will upload us into heaven. That's called the resurrection. And that's where I have real hope for folks. And I also discuss that in my book, 2084. So beware, it's risky to read it.
Well, I encourage everybody to read Professor Lennox's books. As he's just mentioned, they're also in Spanish. So now people have...
2084 is being translated into Spanish as we speak.
Great. So our listeners do not have any reasonable excuse not to read it anymore. So thank you very much, Professor Lennox, for having, for this interview, for your time. It has been a real pleasure and an honor. And I hope that on other issues we can also eventually speak. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.